You're listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hello, my name is Uwe Schulte, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our second series of our podcast, Let's Talk Sustainable Business. The series is brought to you by the Conference Board Global Sustainability Center. Today, I will be talking to Kim Dabbs, Global Director of Social Innovation at Steelcase. First, let me briefly introduce our guest, Kim Dabbs. She is a social entrepreneur, advocate, and innovator who's leading social innovation for Steelcase. Prior to joining Steelcase, she served as Executive Director of the West Michigan Center for Arts and Technology. She holds a Master of Public Administration from the University of Michigan and a Bachelor of Science in Art History from Kendall College of Art and Design. A warm welcome to you, Kim, and please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with social innovation.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for having me as a guest on your program today. You know, when I think about the history of how we all land in the jobs that we have, it always for me has rooted back in purpose and passion. I've always had just this incredible desire to make a difference in the world, and I have had the great privilege of doing that with many different nonprofit organizations, non-government organizations, both in the US and now here where I currently live in Munich, Germany. My time has been very varied between education, between public policy, and now leading social innovation for the company I work for, Steelcase.
Kim, that's encouraging to hear that passion. But before we get really started about your subject, not all our listeners will know exactly what Steelcase is doing. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about Steelcase company and its commitments.
Yeah, so Steelcase is the global leader in creating really amazing work environments for so many different people throughout the world. And we do that both in corporate environments as well as healthcare and education. And my relationship with Steelcase actually started as a nonprofit organization, as a beneficiary of Steelcase's partnerships when I led the West Michigan Center for Arts and Technology before I became a part of their family. But Steelcase, we have a long history and a long commitment to sustainability and to our core values around the environment, social impact around doing business that's good for society. My draw to Steelcase, which is now a little over 5 years ago, was when you understand the impact that a company has in the environments and in the experiences people have in their everyday lives, whether that be in the corporate sector. And for the kids that I was working with directly, it was in those education environments. It really drew me to understand what can I do and how can we leverage Steelcase as a business to be that force for good and continue that commitment throughout the world. So we've made a lot of, I would say, bold goals that aren't new for us. We're over 100 years old, and we operate in many, many different countries throughout the world. And we've always had a lens towards people. We've always had a lens towards human centricity in the way that we design and the products that we deliver, but also in the commitments that we keep as a company.
So I guess quite a few of our listeners will actually use some of your equipment, be a desk or something else.
That's right. So many of the partners at the conference board are Steelcase partners and clients as well, and we always welcome that opportunity.
So, but now let's get started, and we want to talk about social innovation and its potential for business. Before we dive deeper, I think we should try to give a definition of what we understand social innovation to be.
Yeah, I think quite simply, all innovation is social. when we think about the world and the lens that we take to design both experiences and products, I look at social innovation as making sure that we're taking a holistic look at the impact that we have in the world for all of our stakeholders, whether that be clients, our employees, our dealer partners who are throughout the world, our suppliers, and everyone else.
So, but what would your criteria be to say um, the impact is positive? Because that's what you're saying. There will always be a social impact, but it could be, of course, on either side.
That's right. I think designing through that lens of social innovation is such a critical and key differentiator to how businesses do business. For us, I always look at leveraging our business as a force for good, which is language that you're starting to hear more and more throughout the world. Through a social innovation lens, and I would say our key stakeholders on the social innovation side are people, the communities where we live and work, our employees, how they engage. So we always look at that as social innovation impacting communities and building places where people can thrive, where people have a sense of belonging. At Steelcase, what we say is we unlock human promise. And I love that because it's so true that when we think about every aspect of that work experience, what can we do to ensure that employees are thriving in their work, that employees feel a connection to the work they have. And also, like you're saying, when you take a holistic look at that, understanding the implications of the choices that they make to be a positive force for impact in these really unusual times. So when I think of social innovation, I really laser focus in on that vision for the future where we have equity in our communities, where quality education is accessible for more and more children and more communities, and most importantly, that we are living in an environment that is sustainable, and those are the things that will guide our choices.
So in essence, what we want is that well-being is something for everybody equally. Yeah, is that what we're saying?
That's right. In order for everyone to have that sense of well-being and understand what those dimensions are, everyone has to have equitable access to those opportunities.
Now, one important element, of course, is access to education and education itself. Could you give us maybe an example of or two how Steelcase is operating in that field?
Yeah, so one of our social innovation projects that we just launched is called a social innovation lab. And this was a pilot that we tested, and we were trying to figure out how do we start to leverage our global scale, our knowledge, our networks of experts to actually come together to move the needle on positive social impact for students throughout the world. And one of the things that we believe really strongly in when it comes to social innovation is that you must design with the community, not for the community. It's in that act of co-creation where true and lasting change can happen. It's where you start using methods and frameworks like design thinking in their truest form to empower and engage communities where the change is going to impact them the most. So we started our journey with a social innovation lab, and this was during this past 18 months when entire communities across the globe were going through COVID, when we were having this uprising of voices around racial equity. And it was this opportunity for us to bring together all of our community partners and say, what is it? How can we actually use this time and leverage this time of global disruption to close the gap between equity and education and well-being in those educational environments? We posed a global challenge in multiple communities throughout the world, and we had hundreds of people participate in what we consider an open innovation approach for social innovation. And everyone came together, we learned together, we tried to tease apart aspects of the questions that we were asking, understanding those insights that we needed to learn about why there existed a gap in access to education, why some students were thriving in environments and some students were just being left behind. And through this process, we had hundreds of people over 30 different countries come together and explore. We selected 15 of the top most promising ideas where people were able to pilot and test that approach or that intervention within their local community. And we provided them seed funding and some of the experts from the world's leading organizations when it came to innovation methods and mindsets, whether that be MIT or IDEO or different organizations. And what came out of that were really small, focused experiments that are going to start to tip how programs happen, how access to equitable education happen within their local communities. And then what we do at Steelcase is make sure that when they are delivering that in their community, that we serve as a springboard or a catalyst to make sure those stories are shared with multiple communities throughout the world. And we really try to leverage our scale to share those insights because we know change doesn't happen the same way in every community. But how change happens are those really beautiful nuggets that translate across borders and across community, need to be shared and connected.
That sounds like a very encouraging initiative. On the other hand, a big challenge to do this right throughout the pandemic. That must have been quite cumbersome to get this going. Is there a possibility to share a concrete example of a solution that inspired you?
So one of the solutions that always inspires me, and this predated our lab, and I think when you talk about that disruption, so many of our community partners, and we have hundreds throughout the world, and like you said, it is a complex process to do a build and a launch during a global pandemic across borders, across languages. But we also needed to find new ideas, and we needed to accelerate and seed the existing ideas in communities that already had some momentum behind them. So one of the other programs that was closing the gap on equity and education was a program that's called Camp Ignite, and it's in rural Romania. And the students there didn't have equitable access to education, nor did they have access to devices, nor did they have access to the Wi-Fi or any internet connection. So all of these barriers existed when we think about how do we start to design these interventions. So we worked with our local teams to say, how might we close that gap between equity and education during this pandemic? And what they had done was they came up with an opportunity, what's considered a girls' empowerment camp. So what they saw was one of the barriers to equitable access to education was just the gendered outcomes, and girls did not have equitable access to the same education or the same rights as their male counterparts. So our team in Cluj, Romania, they decided they wanted to do something about that. They created what they call Camp Ignite, and they pulled together over 100 girls from throughout rural Romania to go through a week-long camp that was designed to teach resilience, designed to teach autonomy, designed to teach authentic voice, all of these things that were going to be so important to their experience. And as they were doing this, we had to make sure that in order to deliver this during a pandemic, we needed to leverage our partnership. So making sure that the girls had devices. Also, one of the insights that they learned is we can teach girls and give them access to opportunity in their educational settings to make those gains and to have the confidence within their school systems. But they also needed to teach boys what that relationship looked like and how the dynamics of power and privilege were at play. So they ended up having a camp for boys and a camp for girls, and then they finally all came together, and it was this beautiful moment of sharing and coming together, really seeing and understanding this is the difference. Not only were they more engaged in school and having access to the technology and tools to be able to finish their education, they also made commitments to how they were going to strengthen their local community. And I think these holistic approaches, when we think linearly about how do you close that gap between equity and education, it's not always through those formal channels. A lot of it has to do with the culture and then married with the process, tools, and space to make sure that everyone has those equitable opportunities and communities.
Yeah, that is a very interesting example, and I think one can spend more time to really learn how you approach that. But let me ask you a more generic question. With these initiatives, it is often very important. It is important, but it's often difficult to measure impact and also to avoid unintended consequences. How do you make sure that you keep that under control?
Yeah, so we take a design thinking approach, a very human centered approach. So instead of jumping into situations and engagements where you've built something based on a lot of assumptions, what we try to do is we do a lot of small focused experiments. And in order to get away from those unintended consequences, we design with the community because the community is going to understand the ecosystem much better and much faster than anyone else does. So when we think about who is going to see the blind spots that anyone has coming in with a global lens, we're going to have the access to scale and we're going to have the access to resources in new and different ways. But at the local level, the community has such beautiful access to knowledge resources, making sure that they understand what formal and informal systems are at play within their community to know exactly how to design for those unintended consequences that many people don't see. So, those small focused experiments are super important to get instantaneous or really quick feedback. Two, to not design something so huge that by the time that you land it, the situation has changed. If we were to design a global program 2 years ago, imagine what the past 18 months would have done to all of those plans. By having an agile approach, by leveraging things like design thinking is really key and critical to that agility. And then finally, making sure that the people that are impacted by the outcomes are the ones that are actually designing and informing what that looks like is foundational. And that's the way that you start to mitigate a lot of that risk and those unintended consequences because you become incredibly intentional about how you design. And then finally, what we do is we kind of at a very high level, much like many of your partner companies and organizations, we align all of our impact measurements to the Sustainable Development Goals. But we do that through a theory of change framework. So instead of just taking a look at inputs or activities and stopping at outputs, which are like those metrics of number of kids served or number of classes taught, we try to take that next level jump to say, oh, we really want to get to outcomes and impact. So how many students are actually going through higher education or how many students are actually getting to reducing that gap on quality education. So we try to make sure that we have systems and processes in place that actually measure progress instead of just activities.
I think what you're saying is such an important thing, and that is true whether you do social innovation or any other impact that a company might have. It is so important that when you're setting yourself goals, it can't be about just changing processes. It has to be about measuring real impact. That is very, very, very important. And thank you for highlighting that. Now, you already mentioned the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I guess that is part of how you decide where you want to engage. But I have seen that many times people spreading themselves thinly by trying too many things at the same time. So how do you set priorities?
Yeah, for us, it was really important that one, we align to our core business. Where can we actually make a difference? Where do we have it within our scope, tools, geography to be able to move the needle towards positive impact? And what are going to create the conditions for the future of work, which is what our core business is? How do we design those environments? How do we make sure that that future is for everyone? Reducing inequalities was critical. We know that that's just foundational to who we are as a society and making sure everyone has access to opportunity. For us, education was critical because we know that in order to have equitable access to opportunities, we need everyone to have access to education. And then finally, sustainability has been core to who we are and what we do for over a century. And we know in order for people to have equitable access to opportunities and education, they need healthy environments to live and thrive in. So for us, we said in the social innovation space, these are the three areas that we really want to focus all of our investments and all of our impact, measure all of our progress in the communities where we live and work through that lens.
Now that's the priority setting around the subjects you want to tackle. But there's also the element. Your role is global, so there's also the question: where do you engage? Which parts of the world?
Yeah. What we have made a decision is that we're going to engage in all of those communities where we live and work. Our employees, our teams are incredibly important, and they're critical to our success in delivering holistic impact in the community. So my goal as we've taken a look around the world and taken a look at those three impact areas of equity, education, and the environment, I'm one person. Our executive team is only so many people. In order to do this, we needed to build a movement to engage all of our employees throughout the globe. And by doing so, we've targeted specific locations where we have a presence, where we have a critical mass of employees, where we can actually make a lasting difference in that community. We've created a program which we call our Change Core, and the only prerequisite to form a change core in the location is that you have at least two people, so a duo, that is critically passionate about equity, education, or the environment. And we work with them to identify different community partners and different ways that meaningful change can happen. So for us, in order to build that global movement, we've prioritized those locations where we have employees, and where we know that we can dedicate resources, because it's more than just money. We can donate money to a lot of different communities throughout the globe, but we want sustainable, lasting change. We want the knowledge of our employees to actually enhance the impact within a community. We want to make sure that we don't parachute in and then leave the next day. We are a part of that fabric of the community. And in order to have holistic change, we need to be a holistic part of the solution.
Yeah, I understand that, and it sounds pretty ambitious, I must say, to do this everywhere where you are. And let me challenge that a little bit. I mean, there is Kim sitting in Munich, and you are in how many countries? I've forgotten now, 130 or something like that.
Not quite that many, but yeah, we have a lot of countries and a lot of locations throughout the world. And when we had started this approach, it is ambitious. Um, and I remember speaking to some of our senior executives as we were proposing this new strategy and rolling it out, and they're like, "This is Steelcase. Um, your issue isn't going to be trying to recruit people. It's making sure that you have opportunities for everyone that wants to get engaged." Because as soon as we opened up this Change Core program, so many people came running through the door to say, "I want to do this in my community." whether that be an operations engineer in Pune, India, or whether that be one of our salespeople in an office in San Francisco. The projects and partnerships that they're creating are absolutely inspiring. We live in an incredibly volatile world. Social innovation at its core, we see some of the darkest parts of struggle in the human condition. And the other side of that is seeing so many people join hands throughout the world to try to make a difference in those areas. And it fuels me to keep going every single day, to see how committed our employees are, to see how committed our community partners are to making a difference in the world, and making sure that we're embedding those policies, those practices in everything we do.
Yeah, I still admire the fact that you have set very high standards, and you have certain principles, like bringing design thinking in, involving people from the onset, and to do things with people jointly, to maintain that standard throughout the world must be a challenge.
It's always a challenge. I think that gap between aspiration and reality, whether that be in social innovation or anything else, that gap's always going to exist. And I always worry that because that gap's always going to exist, that people won't try. And for me, I would rather set some bold goals and race towards them, because this is forever work. I can't think in my career or in my lifetime that equity, education, and the environment are suddenly going to be solved in my tenure, in my role. But what I can make sure is that we have calibrated the systems for people to be audacious, to run towards progress, and to make sure that they care and are part of their community.
Kim, excellent. I think you just made a very, very important plea for just do it. Yeah, get on with things. When you see something needs doing, involve everybody, have the goal in mind, but don't be hesitant and have all those constraints in your head. That very, very excellent. Thank you so much for that. We have to talk also about how that actually relates to your business in more detail. But for today, there will be not enough time, so we have to put that into the next episode, which I'm looking forward to having the conversation with you for today. Thank you so much, Kim, for sharing your passion and your approach with us.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. And to our listeners, if you have enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our podcast series or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcasts. You can also write to us and make suggestions and give us feedback on sustainability@tcb.org. Thank you for listening, and please join us again in 2 weeks' time. Thank you and goodbye.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.